Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Edinburgh. It's great to see so many people here and lots of familiar faces from our last meeting and also from the university community that I recognise. So this meeting has been organised jointly with Friends of Scotland, and they're going to hear from them a bit later. And we're going to do the meeting in two parts. So we're going to first of all hear about Paris and 1.5 degrees report. So Kevin's going to tell us some of his views about that, and we'll have some discussion then around that. And then for the second part, we'll move more towards Scotland's targets. Kevin and his colleagues have written a report, Friends of the Earth, which has been discussed, findings have been discussed today in Holyrood. So there'll be some discussion about Scotland and particularly what we can do as a community ourselves. So we'll hear a bit more about that from Friends of the Earth later. Caroline Grant and Richard Dixon are here from Friends of the Earth. So thank you for organising this with us. And of course, thank you very much to David Somerville, who's done a lot of the work behind this meeting. So Kevin Anderson, so I guess he's known to many of you. He's Deputy Director of the Tindall Centre for Climate Change Research. He's based in Manchester. He's well known for his rigorous, his incisive and science-based analysis of carbon budgets and their relationship to climate mitigation policies, as well as his analysis of the response of policymakers and the scientific community to these insights. It makes for a unique and potent brew of climate science, policy, sociology and politics. And Kevin does not shy away from the political implications, nor the implicit political and social assumptions that shape and frame discussion of carbon budgets. So I'm going to now hand over to Kevin, and we'll hear for about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to David, and David will mediate the discussion part.
Okay, thank you. Oh, you all hear me okay? Yeah, good. So I've tried to shoehorn in this bit about 1.5 degrees C into a wider presentation, and I've been told to try and keep it constructive about what the things that we can do about climate change, but it's also important to remind ourselves of what the challenges to which we have to respond. Never as unwavering as what we've done for 28 years on climate change. So I've called this here Climate's Holy Trinity, the potency, tenacity and courage. I have a Twitter account which don't even work, even on that if you want to. I'm going to start off with a quick thought experiment. So just sit there thinking about this. Imagine, that's going to be very hard to imagine climate change was actually considered a serious existential threat. I know none of us think like that, it's just a sort of ruse. But imagine we actually thought climate change was serious. And then imagine we had regulations that forced the top 10% of global emitters to reduce their carbon footprint to the average European level. So, is that too much to ask? Just the 10%. And the other 90% do nothing, just carry on as normal, same level of emissions. So it's just 10%. Some of you may have heard me say this sort of thing before, but do you have any idea what the reduction in global emissions would be? 1/3. So only 10% reduced their level to the level of the average European, not the average Ghanaian. And that's a 1/3 cut in global emissions. I mean, you have the Paris agreements together, Paris pledges, and you get no reduction by 2030.
Are you talking individuals or companies?
No, this is the activities of individuals. So it's the high-emitting individuals. It's the activities. It's based on the Chancel and Piketty report in 2015. You can choose out from their analysis. You have to do the calculation yourself. So I'm going to come back to that later, but it feeds into my provocation that the rapidly dwindling 1.5 and 2 degrees C carbon budgets, aligned with emission responsibilities that I was trying to allude to there anyway, embed equity at the heart of any real mitigation agenda. That wasn't true in 1990, when the first IPCC report came out, or in 2000. In 2018, I think equity is an absolutely pivotal central issue that comes out of the maths response to climate change. The taboo issue of the huge asymmetric distribution of wealth underpins the international community's failure to seriously tackle climate change. Now, it sounds like a socialist agenda, but I think you can show that again just via the maths. And only when we acknowledge these inequalities will thinking on climate change be sufficiently mature to transition from incrementalism to system change. All we've had so far is incrementalism at best. So that's my provocation. And this is the world that dominates, I think, at the moment, the model that dominates how we think about climate change, pretty much everything else. So you're probably all very familiar with this sort of view of the Davos fraternity, the morally bereft. And the way forward, of course, is steady as she goes. We're fine, we're doing just fine. It maintains the dominant economic paradigm and continued growth of resources and power skewed to a privileged few. And I'll try and come back to this later on. It particularly holds for emissions, but I think it also holds for the end of austerity. I never saw austerity. No other professor did either. Only poor people saw austerity. And on climate, I would argue that the Davos paradigm is legitimised by a whole suite of what I refer to pejoratively, I'm proud to say that, the climate glitterati. Mark Carney, Adair Turner, John Gummer, Nick Stern, probably one of the nicer ones of this group, Christiana Figueres, Bloomberg, Al Gore. These people have carbon footprints the size of very large African towns, if not small states, and they tell the rest of us to reduce our emissions. So in addition to this, this group who no doubt fly around the world in their private jets, they're supported by a whole cadre of senior climate academics who get their kudos from rubbing shoulders to this group and occasionally invited to talk to them. And this lot support offsetting negative emission technologies, geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, and green growth. Now, there's good work being done on these things, but this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to use to respond to these challenges. And I don't mean here the PDRAs, the postdocs. I don't mean the lecturers. This is generally the very senior, usually grey-haired, often men, but not always, professors who have said nothing interesting in the last 10 years. It's all about incremental evolution within the system. We mustn't question the system. And that's, I would argue, why we've responded to climate change with complete inaction. So let's put some bones, some flesh on the bones of this provocation. But I'm going to start off here with the climate message from the Pope. I can't remember if I used this one before. I think he Feynman last time. This time it's the Pope. The Alliance of Technology, if any of you want to look at a book that captures climate change really well, I would recommend the Pope's encyclical. I'm not a Catholic, and you can miss out the spiritual stuff if you want. But actually captures a lot of the really important issues about climate change in the encyclical. He's very well advised, and he seems to be quite a writer. The Alliance of Technology and Economics ends up sidelining anything unrelated to its immediate interests. Whereas any genuine attempt to change, to introduce real change is viewed as a nuisance based on romantic illusions. And we so often hear that. That's not realistic. You can't do that. That'll never work. So that's the sort of language we always hear that closes down debate, that opens up when we want to open up a box that's too challenging to the system. So what is the international agenda on climate change? Well, you're all familiar with the Paris Agreement and what we promised to do here is to take action. That's quite important, to take action. It wasn't just to talk about it. To hold to well below 2 degrees centigrade, not near that in 1.5, to do so in accordance with the best science, which I would argue is broadly a carbon budget framework, and on the basis of equity. And as I was saying, it's happening in Hollywood. No country in the world is taking any notice of the equity issue, none of the wealthy countries. It's just lip service. We never think about equity issues, and I'll talk about that later on. We've already ignored that issue, including the Committee on Climate Change. But I've been asked to say something about the 1.5 degree C report, which extremely you're all reasonably familiar with. It was on the press and it was even covered in, I think, the Daily Mail Online. I'm not sure what it said, I was like, and perhaps I should have read it. So here we have a copy of the report. For me, there are two explicit and headline conclusions from it, and one implicit message. And I was not keen that we had a 1.5 degree C report. I think in retrospect, I was probably wrong on that. I think in some ways, I think it's a good thing to have. I was very uncertain of actually we spent all this time pretending we can hit 1.5, but I think there are some merits to it. So the two headline conclusions, just using a couple of these slides as backdrops from the report. The first is the impact. Great surprise. The impacts at 2 degrees C are noticeably worse than the ones at 1.5. That wasn't a great revelation, I would have thought. But it was interesting to see the work brought together as to what is the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, other than just half a degree. And there are some significant sets of impacts that we can tease out from the science. But it also makes fair to say there's a lot of uncertainty remaining there. But we significantly higher ecosystem impacts across the board, pretty much. So regardless of whichever category you look at, it looks noticeably worse, mostly worse at 2 degrees C. Significantly higher Consequently, there are chances of additional feedback to make the situation considerably worse. So 1.5, quite often it was suggesting, well, that we might just be lucky not have some of the feedback. At 2 degrees centigrade, there was a great feeling that we were great confidence that we wouldn't be getting additional feedback to make the situation worse. And I don't know quite how they do this, but around an extra $500 million, in fact, I think it's 420 million, too precise for my liking, and about 500 million people, additional people, seriously impacted by climate change if you go to 2 degrees centigrade rather than 1.5. And that's quite a significant size of the population. That's more than the population of the EU, more than the population of the US. So it's a large number of people. The second headline that I think is important is that they made the comment, and they made this comment pretty much about everything anyway, that planetary scale negative emissions are a prerequisite of holding to 1.5. So none of those, all the scenarios they considered have some form of negative emissions, whether that's afforestation, which I think is problematic, or maybe reforestation, which is less problematic, or lots and lots of negative emission technologies. And what's also important there is that if you look critically at the scenarios, you can see they all go on well beyond the end of the century, which I think we have to bear in mind, that almost all the scenarios end up cutting off at 2100. But we're relying on the people in the next century, so some of you might still be alive there with a bit of stem cell research. I haven't been here for a while yet, but the kids, and your kids will be having to deal with this, sucking our CO2 out of the air. CO2 we put up today, they'll be sucking out in the next century. That's not what just remind ourselves of that. But the other sort of implicit headline that I think is really disturbing, and it's not surprising, and you can probably guess where I'm going with this after my opening slides, is that when we look at the sustainable goal number 8, well, I'm surprised. The IPCC claim, and it's the IPCC, what I mean, the IPCC economists claim few trade-offs and strong synergies between hitting 1.5 and economic growth. Well, another wonderful message for us to take home. And you look at that, here's the trade-offs, the synergies, trade-offs, synergies, trade-offs. And every time the synergies are bigger than the trade-offs. And I wrote a response to the 1.5 report, and it was on the Manchester blog site. You can have a look at it there if you want to, Manchester University blog site. And I just threw out this quote from it, which sort of captures my view. The IPCC report meticulously lays out how the serious climate impacts of 1.5 and warming are still far less destructive than those of 2 degrees centigrade. It makes clear 1.5 is not a safe threshold. Sadly, the IPCC then fails again to address the profound implications of reducing emissions in line with 1.5 and 2 degrees C. Dress it up however we may wish, climate change is a rationing issue. And that's what it is. We have a certain budget to spend. And one person spends more, someone has to spend less. It's a rationing issue. We don't like the language, but it's tough. We should have done something about it a long time ago. And I would argue that ignoring the huge inequality in emissions, the IPCC chooses to constrain its policy advice to again fit neatly within the current economic model. How can we make the Paris 1.5 degrees C fit with Davos? Because we say it's all great synergies with economic growth. So it's not a great position to start from, I think. But that's my upbeat interpretation of the 1.5 degrees C report. So I think I'll stop there and I'll carry on after that. So back to you, Simon. Or Dave. Was that switching the upbeat? Oh, that's sort of the best.
Here's a man who studied the science. We thought that before we go into the looking at what we might do here locally in Scotland, we'd get any reflections. Is that working? Are you able to hear me okay? And we'd get some reflections from colleagues in the room. And I'd be particularly glad of any reflections which are from people with different disciplines to Kevin's. So, any takers for that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you very much. Really interesting and inspiring talk. My reflection is that I think when we're looking at how to frame the climate message in the future, I mean, there's a fair chance that we're going to blow through 1.5 degrees and possibly 2 degrees when you look at how emissions are increasing. It puts us in a really uncertain future. So the idea of equity, I think, is really important, because if we're framing the debate, you need to frame it somehow that there's some sort of positive. And if it really means we have to change, everything, then at least we frame it as something that's positive, this change being positive, even if we're going to be in a certain future, we don't really know if we're going to get to 4 or 5 or 6 degrees. And I think that's really going to be key, because otherwise it's just a message to doomsday or where.
Thank you.
Just stay here, where you're from if you want, background.
Okay, Alistair MacDonald from the Dick Vet School in University. In The Guardian today, there's a report that since 1970, 60% of the animal life on this planet has now gone. And so climate change is also having an impact on animals as well as the human population. And that should be taken into account.
David? My name's Evie Murray, and I'm from a local leaf charity called Leaf Community Crops and Plots. And I'd like to know what Scotland can do about China and their carbon emissions.
Hi, my name is Willie Black. I'm United Union campaigner. Is there anything that you can point to as an example that they have raised that's positive about what we can do in the present moment, so that we in Scotland can maybe be inspired by other people on what they're doing? I understand what you say in terms of the system. We have to change the system ultimately, or we're doomed. But nevertheless, within the system, is there anything that we can do at the present time and campaign round on the scale that's required, rather than just tinkering about with blue buckets or recycling?
Hi, my name is Michaela, and I work within a community in Midlothian to try and support low carbon behaviour. It's quite a private community, and it's quite a frustrating job because obviously these aren't the people that are the big emitters. But obviously we've got government funding. So the thing that I feel positively about is that I see a shift in low carbon behaviour as the way for social cohesion. So getting people out of their cars, for example, getting people into community gardening, getting people together somehow around, so getting away from, all these kind of things that we've told we need to be successful human beings. We've stopped realising that we need each other. But the other thing is, it's really frustrating to see that there's a system change that needs to happen. And how do we, when I look at all the plans for roads around our area, when I look at all the new housing built, we're building in kind of like carbon in the future. Like, how can we, I don't know what to, where do we go first to start that kind of long-term, apart from just like this idea that we can each kind of, turn off our lights.
Thank you.
Marcus, well, I'm UK Energy Research Centre and and University of Edinburgh. So I'm slightly worried about babies and bathwaters here, because you're saying that, okay, there's something inherently misplaced about techno-economics as its inability to deal with this problem, okay? So we've got a body rather similar to the IPCC called CCC in the UK, who are doing a pretty good job at the moment of exposing UK government policy failures. The guy who runs the IPCC now, chief exec, used to be the head of Scottish Government's Energy Directorate. And he's invited the UK government to explain why it's opposed to the lowest cost carbon innovations, carbon technology, why we're not finding least cost routes to system change. So by kind of saying this model, this framing of experts independently kind of, okay, IPCC won't go until national government tend to kind of change its economic policies, just won't do that, as personally said recently in Edinburgh. But CCC are in the business of doing that now, and they're holding policy makers' feet to the fire on this. So I'm not slightly worried you're kind of undermining one of our institutions who can help us along the way here.
Kate Garner, also from the DigVet. I had a question about redistributing food in terms of, one, animals are a great producer of methane, and two, where folks live is not where the food is produced. So obviously there's a lot of CO2 emission that goes into feeding the populations and where we are, and kind of approaching that as obviously a necessary thing, but figuring out how to do that in the best way.
Could you pass it back?
Hi, I'm Dr. Eleanor Harris from the Confederation of Forest Industries. I was really struck by your first statistic about inequality and the top 10%, and I think that's really striking and really important. What I was less convinced by was what seemed to be an assumption that inequality, growth in inequality and growth in economic growth necessarily go hand in hand. And I think there's a risk in getting caught up in a rhetoric. I think rationing is exactly right as well. But I think we risk forgetting how rich we are. Most people in China are just reaching the point where they can afford toilet paper. And I don't think there's anyone in the room who thinks that it would be an acceptable, fair situation that we should all get reduced down to a point where we're not allowed toilet paper. I think we think that was a fairly low standard of that everyone else in the world should come up to. So I think you're absolutely right about the inequality, but I'm not totally convinced about the economic growth. I think there's more to be thought about in that.
Hi, I'm Rachel Howell, a lecturer in sustainable development here. I don't have a different perspective to yours, but I just want to clarify the perspective on equity, because we know that middle-class people in rich countries don't think of themselves as among the wealthiest people in the world, but we are. Yeah. And so I'm wondering who the 10% top emitters are. Are they all people like Al Gore, or are we in the 10%? And I think that would be useful to clarify in terms of talking about equity.
Very much so.
My name is Ian Baxter, for the agent. I wonder if you agree that the IPCC report severely underestimated positive feedback effect. An example being that it was suggesting that by the end of this century we would only see a blue ocean event in the Arctic once every, I think it was 100 years. Whereas even Peter Wadhams, who's probably the foremost expert on this in the UK, has said that we'll probably see a blue ocean event within the next 5 years, and then within about 5 years after that, we'll see one every single year.
We'll be wrapping up shortly this little session, which is just some points coming in from different perspectives.
From the Met School. Got a question just about the curriculum and whether, from your perspective, in terms of evolving the curriculums across your own university and indeed other universities, you have some suggestions as to how we can do that so that we can actually integrate that social dimension that you were referring to in terms of equity, and how we actually can do that in a way that meets the needs of all of our stakeholders.
So there are some seats down at the front here if anybody wants to come down. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Thomas. I'm a student from the Masters in Carbon Management. I really like what you said. I've been saying that to my friends for years, but it's nice to hear it from someone that's definitely strongly influenced me. I just want to say also, kind of answering to some of what other people have said, that I would say that one of the first things we should do is take businesses and private corporations out of the talks regarding sustainability and climate change. For instance, last Tuesday, there was an event organized by the WWF Scotland about what Scotland can do to limit their emissions to avoid climate change. And there were business representatives there, and I feel very uncomfortable about that. I don't think private agents should be included in the conversation when it comes to that, and they should just be imposed upon what they have to do.
My name is Keith Burns. I'm an engineer. I've spent most of my career generating electricity. I'm concerned about the importance of learning from our mistakes. And the example I'd like to cite is the extremely bold experiment that Germany has been carrying out on our behalf, and that is their energy vendor policy. As a result of German energy vendor, Germany now has the highest carbon emissions per capita of any nation in Europe. It's burning more lignite for baseload and grid balancing than it has ever done before, and its carbon emissions have gone through the roof. Can you suggest how we can learn from these mistakes, please?
Anybody here? How long have we got to do for?
I'm Johanna Carey from Transition Edinburgh. I've been reading a book by Leo Buxley about climate majority. Now, I agree with a lot of what you're saying about justice and equality and system change, but his point is we have to untie it from politics so that it's not just the greeny loonies that want this change, it's everybody. I think in Scotland we do have a political majority that says that, but people still think they're a bit loony left if you want these things. If we want the sort of things you're saying about system change, that seems to me it's taking us further left, not more into the middle ground, which might make it difficult to get everybody on board.
Hi, Kevin. My name is Ian Fuller. I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm reading for a PhD in wind and marine energy systems tonight. I'm sitting in a few lectures recently and we're talking about the energy mix, oil and gas, coal and renewables and nuclear. And people sometimes say, oh, why do we still see such a big prevalence of fossil fuels in the energy system? And I say vested interests, and people have a jolly good laugh. And I don't think that's untrue, but I'd love if you could comment on the impact of inverted commas vested interests in this domain, and then I'll go back and tell everyone what PhD is.
I'd like to take a couple more, maybe.
Hello, my name is Lisa McKeever. I'm with Young Friends There Scotland, and I'm a divestment company. This is just more of a reflection, and there's been talks about system changes. But I actually just want to bring the reality back into the room that for young people, this report isn't something that's just for policy changes. This is the future that we've been handed, and I don't have a choice in engaging in this. And to say that it puts people off to not change the system is actually kind of an insult to my generation and the generations after.
Hello, my name's Jacqueline Fletcher and I work for Gaia Education. There was mention up there of food, and somebody down there was also talking about the loss of animals. So I would like to know what you think about something that was actually proposed in the IPCC report, I think, about regenerative agriculture, but just seems to be dismissed as one of the solutions to actually saving biodiversity and sequestering carbon.
I've got somebody down here. Could you pass this down?
Hi, my name is Maria and I'm a Sustainable Development student at the University. I'm here. Hello. I'm just wondering about the IPCC report, or in general, like climate change and how we communicate it, because like 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, like for an average person that isn't very interested in climate change, doesn't sound as a big threat. Like during summer, the temperature goes up from 21 to 25, or like no, 21 to 23. I'm very bad at math. And in Norway, where I'm from, we're very happy because there's always snow. But I'm just thinking whether you have any idea of how to communicate it better so climate change becomes more of a tangible thing that we can see and see the effects, because right now it's all just a blur and people are talking about it being something that's fake and something that's real. So maybe that could be something that could be improved.
That's it now.
Hi, my name's Callum. I'm a community worker, is what we used to get called. And my comment in response to that, I mean, I've listened to the audience here, it seems to be quite an informed audience. The groups that I work with are communities, lots and lots of people that are a million miles away from what's just been presented. And the day-to-day conversations that people take place, they're about survival, about working areas, deprivation quite a lot, they're struggling to survive. So they're really not interested in that. They're a million miles away from that. So how do we get what's on the board, what you're saying, what everybody else here is saying, how do we get that into people's everyday life, way of working, way of thinking, way of breathing, people's skills?
Yeah.
I'm going to leave my question as well. Some privilege. Which is that you told us what the IPCC hasn't done in its third report, in its special report, and what's unsatisfactory about it. Are there any aspects where they are giving clear pointers which we can hang on to and can advocate?
Well, the impacts again, the more big one, that's really useful impact.
And now I'm going to ask Caroline Rance, who's the climate campaigner for Friends of the Earth Scotland, to just give a tiny bit of background. Oops, I think maybe you better come this way so you're in the screen. A tiny bit of background on the research which was commissioned and the role that, as a civil society organisation, Friends of the Earth Scotland has.
Thank you. I'll talk for long enough to let Kevin think up answers to a couple of those questions. So the context of this visit, the reason that we asked Kevin to come up to Scotland this week, is that there's a new climate change law which is going through the Scottish Parliament at the minute. Can I ask how many people are aware of that? That just down the road, oh, good, you are informed of things. But still, there are some of you within this room who are clearly interested in climate change. You care enough to be here tonight listening to this. You don't know that this is happening. And just down the road, in the Scottish Parliament, there are MSPs literally just sitting around a committee room deciding on our future, deciding on what role Scotland is going to play in the future of the planet. And us at Friends of the Earth and Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, we're quite concerned with the discourse around that climate bill. And the reason that it came about was because the Scottish Government said they wanted to see Scotland playing our part in the Paris Agreement. The First Minister said that she will see Scotland playing our full part in delivering 1.5 degrees. And then the climate bill came out. It was published in May, and it doesn't do those things. It's really weak. It's really poor. It says, despite everything that we just heard, the messages of urgency from the IPCC, everything we know about what we need to do if we have any chance of keeping to 1.5 degrees, all of the kind of media headlines that you heard about 12 years to save the world, it says, actually, in Scotland, yeah, we don't need to do anything extra for the next 10, 12 years. We'll just continue business as usual. And then maybe around 2040, we'll think about doing a little bit extra. And so it pushes all of this. It just kicks the can down the road. It pushes action way out to 2040, to 2050, and then we'll think about doing something extra. And that's absolutely not good enough. You all know that's good enough. Not good enough. So Friends of the Earth and Stop Climate Chaos, we asked Kevin and the Tyndall Centre at Manchester to do a bit of research for us to inform this debate, because the way that the Scottish Government have approached this bill is it is quite technocratic. It's bottom up. They kind of looked around them at the things that we know how to do today. They've said, oh, we can maybe put some wind turbines over there, and we can put some electric vehicles there, and then we can sort of add that up, and that will get us roughly to that place by 2050. They didn't look at the big picture of what Scotland needs to do as part of the global picture. They didn't take a carbon budget. They didn't factor in any equity. They didn't apportion that down to Scotland and say, oh, okay, this is what we need to do. So that's the piece of research that we asked Kevin and his colleagues at the Tyndall Centre to do. And I think it's just really important when you're fully informed at the end of Kevin's lesson, that we all understand that we have a role to play in this. We absolutely, it's not good enough to understand this intellectually and then do nothing. We absolutely have a role in this. And we have to hold those people just down the road in the Scottish Parliament, we have to hold them to account, and we have to make sure that they're making the right decisions and doing the right thing. And a very small thing that you may wish to do this evening, just starting, there's a clipboard making its way around, which is just very simply a message to MSPs, to your MSPs, just saying that UK, that this is an issue that they need to work on. But that's a small thing. Yeah, there will be, I'm sure, much more discussion afterwards about how people can get together and organise and collectively put pressure on. But this is a really key moment for Scotland. It's a big opportunity. So take in all of the things that Kevin says and then do something with that knowledge.
Okay, right. I can't answer all of those. You can probably guess that.
I'm hoping that in the course of your you might touch on some of these.
I will do. Yeah.
There will be more discussion afterwards. Right? So.
Yeah, okay. But I will discuss a lot more about the equity issue as I go through this, and your very important point about private communities who are actually pivotal, both in terms of suffering from the impact, but actually are part of the solution. And I'll come back to that towards the end. I appreciate a lot of the comments that are made on animals, and what we're doing to the ecosystems of this planet that have been here for pretty much 3 billion years, probably with various forms of ecosystems since we've had some sort of life on this planet, and we've been here for a nanosecond and destroying huge numbers of those. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I was looking somewhere recently at the mass of domestic animals compared to the mass of wild animals, and it's just basically it's all domestic now. There are no wild animals left on this planet, from a proportional point of view. So it's just really disturbing what we're doing there. What can we do about China? Well, I think by example would be not a bad idea. Close off the fossil fuel industry down with some just transition for the workers. But there are lots of other things we can do about China. We're going to have to tackle the WTO on that, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. The World Trade Organization. We need to make sure that we already don't import things if they're poisonous. They've got lead-based paints in toys. We don't import them. Well, how come if they've got a high carbon footprint? How about we don't import those? Because they're also very dangerous to our children as well. So we have to rethink some of that sort of agenda. I don't know where to go with all this. Perhaps I'll pick them up as I go. I'll try and pick them up as I go through. Equity was an important part. I'll come back to that repeatedly, and very much professors and probably a large proportion of you here are in the top 10 to 20% of global emitters. If you're on a plane once a year, put yourself in that category. And those of you who aren't here at university, you're desperately aspiring to consume as much as possible. That's why you're at university. Of course, that's the measure of progress in our society. We don't have to be like that, but that's what we have at the moment. It's our job to kick it. I'll make one comment on the system thing. I think the system and the individual, that sort of language is actually unhelpful. They're two sides of the same coin. And they're also important issues of leadership. Leadership is not top down. Leadership is as much bottom up as it is top down. And I made that point somewhere. One of the points I wrote down here, there's a democratic contract that we have. So climate change is about politics, not about the big P, but the small p. Climate change is a political issue. I do not want it divorced from politics. It's not a science issue. It's a political issue. It's a cultural issue. And that means we have a role in that. In a democratic society, we have a role. We are contractually obligated to engage with our policymakers. If we sit on our asses at home just moaning and not engaging, then it's not their fault, it's our fault. So it's a partnership between bottom up and top down. And I'll come back to that a bit more. And the energy vendor, it would help with it, and I'm probably getting boost this, but you should not have prematurely closed down the nuclear power station. What you do not do is close down nuclear power stations prematurely. You may not build new ones, you do not close down your existing ones. It's a stupid thing to do when you're trying to deal with climate change. It's about 5 to 15 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour compared with CCS at about 100, 200 grams, gas at 450 and coal at about 900. So it's very, very low carbon. Maybe you don't build any more, but you don't close them down and expand the lignite mine next to the one crop last year. which was offset, of course. It was a zero emission cop rustic that offset it, even though they were expanding the league like mine next door at the time. So, yeah, there are lots of problems with some of these things that are ongoing, but we also have to look for the good lessons in there as well. There's some good things that come out of energy render in terms of solar and so forth. Anyway, I'll progress from that, and hopefully I'll touch on these as I go through, and if not, you can grab hold of me later on, gently. So what was our response to the challenge I'm sort of laying out here? Well, I think we have to start with a bit of humility. We just have to remind ourselves, particularly people of my generation, I can see quite a few of you here of my generation, maybe even fractionally older. The first IPCC report was 1990. So some of you here, your parents hadn't met. Your parents were very enriching puberty when we had the first report out from the IPCC. Throughout all of your lives, your parents and I and other people of my generation have known what to do about climate change. Those of us are struggling day to day. And yet in 2017, emissions were 65% higher. So not only have we known what to do, but we just watched the emissions go up. We haven't cared about your future. Little more than a fashion excess, I often say. And they're still rising. 2017, they went up by 1.5%, and almost certainly this year, the emissions will go up again. In 2018, 28 years after the first IPCC report, over a quarter century since the first Rio summit, emissions are still going up. And so 28 years of optimistic rhetoric, smiling fools who think we're going to solve it with technology or some other, simple solution. This is a much more deeply rooted problem than we're prepared to accept. And we've had a whole litany of scams to stop us doing anything. Offset. The amount of climate change conferences where you can offset emissions. Imagine what that means. If you offset emissions, double the price of the offset, which is only about £2 anyway. Double the price, pay £4, and it's a negative emission technology. We're stuck in the CO2 out the air, apparently, you're flying around the world. Utter crap. So you pay the poor person to diet for us. But governments love this. That's one of the clean development mechanisms. So they can pay Ghana to reduce the emissions for us expanding our road network. And then we have the emissions trading scheme with so many permits issued that actually the prices remain virtually zero. Now, that is changing. But years later, after we've stuffed all the CO2 in the atmosphere, we've got afforestation, which has been used in Sweden now. We're going to expand our land of airport. We're at Stockholm, the main airport in Sweden. There's been compensated emissions because we're going to expand the forestry in Sweden. Plant a tree, expand an airport. Speculative negative emission technologies. When all of these things fail, we're already embedded in virtually all of the models that advising governments assume that these things will work. And not that they'll stoke about 100 million tonnes here and there. You're talking about hundreds of billions of tonnes of CO2 to be sucked out of the system by these technologies that we don't really have. We do not have. They may work, they may not work. Fusion may work, fusion may not work. And then when that fails, we've already got economists and engineers coming together to look at firing rockets into the structure to spread out sulfur particles to reflect sunlight into space, or cloud brightening, which maybe slightly less problematic. So we've already got people looking at these things. What we haven't done is reduce our CO2. It's a very reasonable thing to do. Reduce our CO2. And we like to think it's all about China. But let's look at the UK or Scotland or Sweden or Denmark or France. They're climate progressive countries. Imagine there's PLCs. They're not worried about, just the convenient boundaries they use. So, all leading on climate change, yet the emissions have reached virtually unchanged since 1990. So we'll often hear politicians and co-opted academics telling us how we've reduced our emissions. But actually, look at Scotland. It's had no reduction in its emissions in how it operates since 1990. Nor is the UK, nor is France or Denmark. And in aviation and shipping, remember the climate only cares about carbon dioxide emissions. It doesn't care about your convenient accountancy framework. And what we've done internationally, we just said that emissions from aviation and shipping are the responsibility of God. Because no country takes responsibility. But they do change the climate, surprisingly. Basic physics. So adding aviation and shipping, imports and exports, and we've had no reduction from these climate progressive countries. And that gives a very different reflection on it. This should start from some humility. My generation has chosen to fail the next generation. And if you're the next generation, you should be really pissed off at me. But there's no point just being angry. You've got to be angry and you've got to be constructive. So how do you tone your anger down and make it come together collectively so you can start to drive change? Remember, you have power. You don't have to wait for power when you get older. You have power now in many, many respects, particularly collectively. Start to exert that power to push my generation who's chosen to fail you to do something differently. Or just take it from us. So what's the IPCC tell us about Paris? And I'll come back through this later on to Mark's very important about this point about the Committee on Climate Change, which we were discussing this afternoon with one of the advisors to the bill, actually. So, and I synthesised all of the IPCC in this one sentence, which is probably a little unreasonable. It's all about carbon budgets from a climate, from a temperature point of view. It's not about long-term targets. And we've known this for years. In fact, the first report on carbon budgets, which we did, I think, with Simon years ago, and living the carbon budget was something like 2006 in Timberton. So how big is the carbon budget that we have? The carbon budget is a total amount of CO2 we can dump in the atmosphere for any given temperature. And there's quite a lot of uncertainty around it, but there's a good enough proxy for us to understand what the policy government should be delivering. So I'll take the stuff out of the synthesis report here and taking the sort of headline numbers from that. Staying well below 2 degrees centigrade, we have something like 750 billion tonnes of CO2 we can dump in the atmosphere. And probably for quite a few, that means nothing. It's about as useful as 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. And unfortunately, we use this language, which is not meaningful to most people. But most of you probably got some basic maths and arithmetic, and if not, you've got your phone with your calculator on it. So you've got 42 billion tonnes of what we dumped out into the atmosphere last year in CO2. So a quick calculation will tell you about about 18 minutes of current emissions before we have nothing left for 2 degrees C. Forget 1.5, that's just 2 degrees centigrade. Now, of course, the 750 might be a bit bigger or a bit smaller. There's some uncertainty around that, and if you're sort of like, I would argue, actually, if you take any precautionary approach, you would go for a slightly smaller version. You think the climate sensitivity is a bit higher. But some people think the climate sensitivity might be a bit lower. So a bit larger, a bit smaller, but it does not change the policy law. That's basically the headline number from the IPCC. So let's look at this graphically. So this is one of my I finished with my unpublished, and he's sat there now watching Alba. Excellent programme, or either that or the country western programme that he watched. There's a Prof and the Isle of Arran. So these are emissions historically, and before Paris we were heading this direction. It's like 4 to 6 degrees centigrade of warming, which I think is just worth bearing in mind. Between now and ice age is about 5 degrees. So we're talking about something that would normally occur over thousands or tens of thousands of years, occurring in half an hour, basically. So that's where we were heading before, according to the science. Then we have to make sure that we don't have too much precision in the science. We have a lot of accuracy and with ranges, but we don't have a lot of precision. So we don't know if it's 4 degrees C or 6 degrees C we're heading, but in that sort of direction where we were going. Now, with the Paris Agreement, we've reduced that significantly to something like 3 or 4 degrees centigrade of warming. But the only reason we've moved, the only real reason I think that we moved from the other one to this one, and this ongoing discussion we're having with some colleagues on Twitter about this, particularly Glenn Peters, who I have a lot of time for here, we actually agree on this one, is that we're actually really that shift is because of the economic crisis. It's not because of judicious climate change policy. Now, it happens to coincide with some improvements in climate change policy, but overall, the shift is almost certainly just because of the banking crisis. So we can thank them for that, but then we can thank people. And to stay well below 2 degrees centigrade, we have something like 750 billion tonnes. That's it. It could be a bit more, it could be a bit less, depending on your view, whether you want to gamble on your children's future or secure your children's future. So that was like 750 billion tonnes there or thereabouts. That's zero emissions from energy by about 2050. And I won't go into talking a lot about agriculture, but it's a really important part of the picture as well, particularly in Scotland. Probably 25% of the warming, roughly, from the Scottish emissions have come from non-CO2 agricultural type emissions, including significant methane in that. So it's an important sector. We know what to do about it. We know how to reduce the emissions by eating less red meat, moving away from ruminants, animals with 2 stomachs. So if you won't eat animals at all, it's animals with 1 stomach, pigs and chickens, that'll give you a sort of 50 to 75% reduction in emissions. If you go to a plant-based diet, that helps even more, and certain plant-based diets are better than others. So there are lots of things we can do about food, and obviously the waste diet, well, that's important as well. But the most important thing is actually the shift from animals with 2 stomachs to not animals with 2 stomachs. That's the biggest jump can be made. And as an uncle who farmed black-faced sheep for 50 years, my uncle did, he doesn't like me saying this, but really, his sheep were part of the problem. We all knew, or at least we did. But that picture there is so for energy, and Paris actually has this really important element about equity. The Paris Agreement does, the Copenhagen Accord did, the Kyoto Protocol talks repeatedly about the equity implications, and that's basically saying that the wealthy nations will take longer to make the reductions. Sorry, the poor nations will take longer to make the reductions than the wealthy parts of the world. And most of us accept that's a really fair thing to do. But if you look at the CCC, for instance, the CCC do not embed any equity in their analysis. In fact, they would go the other way around. It's highly inequitable what the CCC has done. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So the CCC is not independent in that sense. It takes quite a political view about the UK should take a very colonial view and take a larger chunk of the pie. So we had, what I'm laying out here, I think it's far removed from this sort of enthusiastic cheering at Paris. Much I was in favour of having the Paris Agreement. And why is it we've done this? How is it we can be so enthusiastic about how we're achieving our targets, our goals, our commitment on climate change? And I think it's because the policymakers have received, and I would say have wanted to receive, a very different story. So, and it's being dominated by a group of what I refer to as integrated assessment modelers. They're mostly economists, but they're advised also by engineers and some scientists. They take a relatively simple climate model, they embed a broadly general equilibrium near classical growth model in the middle of it all, and then they bolt in some other stuff about transition theory and so forth in various algorithms. So it's all the equation thing, you wind the wheel out, pops as cost optimal, or sometimes they call it cost effective option. So it's a big model of the world. The total cost of carbon, all those things embedded in them in mathematical forms. And these have or imply massive carbon budgets, much bigger than comes out of science, and therefore much less mitigation. And when you look at the median level of the median scenarios for the 66% and better submissions for 2 degrees C submitted to the IPCC, you get out something like 1,600 billion tonnes of CO2. Remember before I said it's about 750 from now. That's from 2017. Yes, so it looks like that. So what you have here is what you get out of science, if you like, working group 1. That's more like working group 3, which I personally think should not be in the IPCC. I don't think we should have mitigation in the IPCC. I think working group 3 should have ever been there, because it's so much more political than obviously the science is. Science is as near as possible neutral. Scientists never, science is more neutral, scientists never are, but the science gets near to that. The working group 3 doesn't get anywhere near it. It's highly politicised. So for a likely chance of 2 degrees centigrade, we've got 2 options here. We've got the science telling us about 800 billion tonnes in 2017, or about 750 billion tonnes from 2018. And remember, this year we've used it, so we're now getting very near to only having 700 billion tonnes from 2019. And we've got the modelers telling us, no, don't worry, you've got 1,600 billion tonnes. So, and which one are you going to choose if you're a policymaker? Which one are you going to choose if you're an academic flying to another essential conference around the world? So we all love this. It allows us to go to Bali on holiday and all the rest of it. So, how do you make sense? This along with Dr. Strangelove and Merchants of Doubt, are the 2 best climate change films that ever come across, head and shoulders above anything else. This is a wonderful example of how simplistic men look at technology, and it's how we've embedded climate change. So I very recommend that. And the Merchants of Doubt is a wonderful film, and Only Rescues and a cool one. Excellent. The book's really good as well. And we've done that by putting rabbits in the hats. This sounds really flippant, but it's not meant to be. This is actually what we are doing. Now, we are no different to the soothsayers advising Caesar about which day to go to war. So we've got these people who are conjuring up, and that's the appropriate term. I'm not saying I'm not opposed to negative emission technologies, doing research on them. But to assume they work is a moral hazard and is incredibly dangerous. So we've conjured them up, because you can't buy them. They're not in the shelves at the supermarket. They're in the minds of a few academics. They've embedded their computer models in via various algorithms. And people are starting to think about how you might be able to deliver it. But these are not things that are there. And these are going to suck. And remember, these are in all of the models. It's not as if these are, virtually no model for good chance of 2 degrees C doesn't include these and or almost always both of them, massive levels of afforestation. There's hundreds of billions of tonnes of CO2 out the atmosphere. But notice again, beyond the end of the century. So that's what we're relying on. I think that's really disturbing. It goes on. We're relying on this because we can't be asked to act over here. So Paris, some academics and policymakers, rather than focus on urgent and deep litigation today, because that's massively challenging politically and economically, you'd have to question Davos behind that, and we'd rather rely on non-existent technologies in the future. And so when I say we, I don't mean we, of course, we hardly retired living in Tuscany over there. I mean, the younger people here, you invent the technology and stuck our CO2 out with it, pass on to your kids to do the same thing. That's what we're doing. So we're going to stuck huge quantities of CO2 out the atmosphere. You look at most of the scenarios, it assumes ongoing use of fossil fuels. That's convenient for the treasury, isn't it? Absorbing taxes for it. And virtually no change in society, so well, we can remain there. And it's all not like to like that. It's a wonderful future, isn't it? There's no exam in physics. So how do we go from a global position to Scotland? So I'm going back to our report now, how we shift from one to the other. So to limit to 2 degrees C rise, we have a carbon pie. Some simple stuff, and we'll manage the task. That's a type of cake, because so we've got managed the start, and it could be a bit bigger, and it could be a bit smaller. depending on when you look at the science, what your climate sensitivity is and so forth. But it doesn't change the policy mix. And we have to split this carbon pie amongst all of the world's countries. And that obviously is a bit of a challenge. You may well say, well, I want a bigger piece than everyone else. There are essentially things in philosophy whereby what you would do is get the EU would negotiate for Ghana, and Nigeria would negotiate for the United States, China would negotiate for the EU or something like that. And then actually, if you look in philosophy, it tells you quite a lot that actually what everyone tries to do is to make sure it's as fair as possible. When you get China negotiating for China, the UK negotiating for the UK, or the EU, or Americans, everyone tries to fiddle it so they get the biggest piece. So there are some really good examples in philosophy about how to do this sort of thing, but we don't take notes of that. Climate change. So what is a fair slice? The question we asked in the report, what's a fair slice for the OECD? And I'm not going into the details of this, but basically what we're assuming here are massive changes to the poor parts of the world, non-OECD countries, much more challenging than is covered in any of the literature. So it's not as if we've let the poor parts of the world down. I haven't put the plots up, I can tell them about it if you want to, if you ask me. And we've then said, of the carbon budget for the globe, 2 degrees centigrade, take off what we refuse, but assume for the non-OECD, what's left for the OECD? And again, that's going to be a bit bigger, a bit smaller. Then we looked at the OECD and said, what's the proportion for Scotland, for the UK? And we've done that on the basis of things like population, GDP, and grandfathering, in other words, historical emissions. And we used it not just the 1 year before, but it would take like 5 or 6 years and then sort of averaged them out in case there's any anomalies. So we also study in science. And then we've asked, how much do the Scots get of that? And then we've done the same sort of thing there with population, GDP, and grandfathering again. So you do that as well. And we've done the same thing in Sweden. We've done it for the lands in Sweden. We've just done it recently for the EU because we asked them to provide some information for the EU who's thinking about producing budgets. And that's the numbers for Scotland. Including very specific with excluding imports and exports. That probably means nothing to most of you unless you're sort of spreadsheet geeks that loves carbon. But to give a bit of a different feeling, that's 5 to 9 years of carbon emissions. 5 to 9 years to blow 2 degrees C out the window. Not 1.5, 2 degrees. And remember, this isn't a really fantastic chance of 2 degrees centigrade. This is just a reasonably good chance. You wouldn't get in a plane. Hopefully you wouldn't get in a plane at all, but if you were to get in a plane, imagine that, then you wouldn't get in a plane that had a sort of 1/3 chance of crashing. Probably not. Everything probably got quite good for emissions because people wait for it to stop flying. But that's what we're prepared to accept here. So 5 to 9 years only for sort of 66% chance or so of 2 degrees centigrade. So, what's that picture again? So, if we take those budgets and say, well, what does that mean in terms of mitigation rate? Because the overall budgets don't necessarily mean a lot to lots of people. It's about a 10 to 15% reduction in emissions every single year, starting now. When it says now, we're at the beginning of this year. So, we're already a year behind. And remember, cumulative emissions mean that every year you don't hit your percentage, the next year the percentage is higher. And that's the big problem that I think a lot of people really struggle to grasp, that it's different to long-term targets. So if you hit 7% this year, well done, except you're still way below what you should be. So next year you're going to hit maybe 11 or 12%. And if you fail that again, just hit 8%, then it's going to be higher again. And that's the problem, because my generation chose to fail for 28 years. There's very little budget left. We need to look at the total reduction from carbon dioxide from energy of about 80% by 2030. Completely different to what's in the climate bill. What all the sort of rhetoric we normally do, or indeed what we get in the committee on climate change. And a fully decarbonised energy system by about 2035, 2040. That's ships, industry, fridges, cars, everything. And remember, only 20% of the energy we consume at the moment is electricity. 80% of it is not electricity. There's a massive agenda to electrify a lot of things, as well as making low carbon electricity. Let's compare this with the CCC, which I have a lot of time. I've known Chris Stark. I've had a few meetings with him now, the new CEO at the CCC. I think the Climate Change Act, was saying today, I think the Climate Change Act is a wonderful piece of legislation. It's way ahead of 2008, the Climate Change Act. It's way ahead of Sweden's climate law that brought out this year. It's still the best that's there. The problem is it relies on the minister with integrity to instruct the CCC to do things that, like Leo, to be more independent, to do the analysis more brutally, rather than just relying on us to really do things and maximise it around an economic framing. It also, I think, requires the commissioners of the CCC, going back to Mark's point, I think the commissioners of the CCC, and they've got a lot of time and respect for them, I think they have let us down. I think the commissioners from the CCC have not held the line of integrity that I would expect people from their scientific foundation to have done. I think they have sold out. So I think the CCC has been at least semi-autonomous from government, and has taken a political agenda, not a scientific agenda. And having said that, the Secretariat are And they would give a scientific agenda if they were asked to by the minister and if the commissioners supported it. So there's the CCC scenarios, or general pathway. Take away the noise and plot out 2 degrees centigrade and look something like that. And it's almost the same if you use the Swedish climate change law as well. You get the same sort of thing. 2 degrees C is so much more demanding than what the CCC is saying. Remember, that's 2 degrees C, not 1.5. Why are there such differences? And I'll just pick on some of these ones now. First, the CCC's analysis is for an 80% reduction by 2050. It's actually not for 2 degrees centigrade. Now, I would argue that actually, when the early days they used a framing of 2 degrees centigrade, or relative 2 degrees centigrade, that fed into 80%. But they repeatedly have told me, when I've really pushed them on this, Chris Stark and others there, that they have not given advice on either 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5. And I've repeatedly pushed them on that. They said, we give guidance on the 80%. Now, the 80% came out of a view of 2 degrees centigrade, but they no longer advise on that. Of course, they can do it. It's asked to by the minister. And the minister has not asked them to look at 2 degrees centigrade. The minister has asked them to look at 1.5 degrees centigrade, but with no change in the budget up to 2032. In other words, don't look at anything. The Scottish minister, thankfully, has written a letter which actually says, no, you can open up the box between now and 2032 as well. So the Scottish minister asked the CCC to do something that is really important. But the UK minister, Claire Perry, said, let's close the debate down. So the CCC also assume a planetary uptake in negative emission technologies. The most conservative reading you could have in the CCC's work is 3 billion tonnes of CO2 sucked out of the atmosphere in the future when they'll all retire. I think it's probably nearer 7 to 10 gigatons sucked out for the UK. So that allows us to have much less mitigation rates. So we would argue in our work, we have not included negative emission technologies. I would hasten to add, we think we should research them, should be a major funding programme on negative emission technologies, but we should not assume they work in our scenarios. Instead, we assume they work in all of our scenarios. The CCC ignored the equity sphere in Paris and every other agreement as well. So they say, we want a larger piece of the pie, and then they work out what's necessary to deliver on that last piece of the pie. I think that's unfair. I think it's not in line with Paris. And I think we should be pushing it. The academics, again, while we're quite people, but we should be speaking loudly about this, saying that's not in line with what our commitments are. We explicitly embed an equity dimension in our work, which is why it's so significant. The CCC analysis is for all UK CO2. We're focusing just on the energy component here. We've done the Scottish report, we've looked at deforestation and process emissions, but the reason we separated these out is that process emissions from cement, which are about 7% of the world's emissions at the moment, that's for the manufacture of the chemical process of making cement. Cement is essential for the development of poor parts of the world, and indeed for making the low carbon agenda in rich parts of the world. And to penalise poor parts of the world who want to have a decent infrastructure, I think is unfair. So there are no alternatives at scale yet to cement. So we've made some scenarios about that, and lots of other things in there to make it as low emissions as possible, as quickly as possible. But I think it's really important. Just give some sort of idea of it. In the EU, I think we use about 300 kilograms of cement per person, and China uses about 3,000 kilograms per person, because they are building their infrastructure that we already have. And deforestation, we've already deforested and used the land for all sorts of things, and then we blame other people when they deforest. I don't think we should be deforesting, but I think we are part of the problem. When Brazil chooses to deforest, or Malaysia or Indonesia, that's partly our problem. It's not just theirs. We've done that. So I think just to blame them for it is inappropriate. So I think these things should be global overheads. And we can discuss that later, because there are no alternatives to those things at scale at the moment. The CCC use 5-year budgets and which exclude aviation and shipping. And I think they should be included. Now, I understand the Scottish Parliament is actually including aviation shipping, so all credit to it for doing that. I'd like to know how it's actually doing it, but it's good that it's actually doing that. But the UK, it is in the 80% target, but it's not in the budget. Don't ask me what the logic is for that. I can't understand. We include aviation shipping. So there's some big differences between us and the CCC. There are some other ones as well, but if you think what they're doing there is right, then you get a different budget. So let's come towards the end now. Let's look at this real action on climate change. What can we do to deliver on it? And I just realised I meant to put some other slides in that. Anyway, never mind. The ones that actually said what we did need to do. So CO2, as I said before, right from the sort of early experiment, is hugely skewed, and you're probably familiar with this plot. It sort of comes out of the Chancellor's Brigade work. This is where the emissions are from our activities. And I think this is really important. This is at a global level, but I'm pretty sure that this works in Scotland as well. Probably works in this audience here. Someone did some work in Sweden recently looking at professors. Professors had 5 times the carbon footprint of their postdocs and 15 times of their PhDs. 15 times. That's what they're worth it for. So what I'm trying to say is that the emissions are massively skewed. And if you live in Bears Den rather than Drum Chapel, then your emissions will be much higher in Bears Den than some poor person bringing up a tenement block in Drum Chapel. So they'll be saying in Scotland, most emissions are due to the activities of a few. 50% of global CO2 comes from 10% of the world's population, 17% of global CO2 is 10 to 20% of the population from our activities. That's the industries doing things for us, so industries factored in there. These are all emissions from that globally. I would argue, given that, and what I'm saying there, there is no way out of this. If we're serious about the 2 C framing, and as someone said before, we like to blow right the way through it, I think that's true, but if that is the case, we need to be honest. We need to let poor people know in other parts of the world that we're not going to make reductions for them, and therefore they need to be adapting to 4, 5, 6 degrees. So we should be honest about that. If we are going to hit 2 degrees centigrade, I'll argue this is the framework for it. I'm not saying what the details will be, but first, you have to get off the emissions curve now, and there's no way you can do that with kit and tech. Even though as an engineer, and I really wish you could, just said that, I'm a mechanical engineer, design and build offshore oil platforms, so I've got some idea of engineering. We need profound changes that have to be regulated by the high emitters, by people like me. This organisation is slightly different, but my guess is most of us are fairly high emitters. And so we need to see that, and that can drive emissions down very rapidly indeed, and they'll start to get off the curve. And it also allows the poor parts of the world to see their emissions rise, which is what we want. I want to see emissions in poor parts of the world going up, because I do not want the poor to suffer as a consequence of climate change. I want them to benefit from it. In the near term, we need also, and this takes a little bit longer, but not much longer, very stringent energy efficiency standards and conservation as well. But we have to watch out for the rebound effect, Jevons paradox, that every time we save some money on one thing, we buy a jet ski or another flight. But that's not insurmountable. We can do lots of things around that with progressive feed-in tariffs and all sorts of other tools that we can use to address that. And of course, we do require a massive shift in our energy system to becoming fully decarbonised. Not low carbon, zero carbon. It's one of the reasons CCS can't be part of it. CCS is going to be 100 to 200 grams, as I said before, per kilowatt hour. It's very high. So 10 to 30 times higher than renewable nuclear. So we need and I call it a Marshall style, not because I think George Marshall's plans to stop the communists coming to Europe was the right thing, or perhaps it was the right thing, but they were not for those reasons. But actually, the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War gives us a flavour of the sorts of change we're talking about. We're not talking about piecemeal adjustments with the odd bit of carbon tax and all the other tweaking that the integrated assessment models and everything else does on this. We're talking about something much, much more fundamental. This is akin to the shift in productive capacity of society in World War II. People don't like these metaphors, but they capture the essence of what we're talking about here. Even if we don't agree with why we're doing it, we're not going to make tanks this time, we're going to make trams. And to give a flavour of what it is like and why it is we don't like it. When I say why we don't like it, why it is that we, the people that set the agenda, the Davos set, including us Puritanical professors, why we don't like it. Because it actually means that the resources and the labour that go into allowing us to have large homes, holiday homes, second homes, prestige cars, SUVs, multiple car ownership, highly mobile lives, frequent flyer miles, all that sort of things, business and first class, high levels of consumer goods, and a reliance on Scotland and the oil and gas industry. The resources gone into those, both the labour and the economic resources, this is not an issue about being socialist. This is simply saying that those resources are needed to make the Marshall-style transformation of the energy system. So we can go back to all this inequality once we've got back to zero energy. There may be some other sustainable development criteria they might consider. From a climate perspective, all of this here is getting us off the carbon-based energy system. So once we go back to that, we can head back to massive inequality and all that other stuff that we want. So it's not a socialist agenda, it's simply an agenda of maths, science, and our commitments. We need a zero carbon industrial strategy, and we can now talk about that again. That language is last spoken about industrial strategy. People of my generation will know that for 30 years or so that debate was closed down. You couldn't have industrial strategy. You have to believe in something called free market. Which is never been a free market. There has been a market mechanism. But anyway, so there is a positive narrative around this. This is massive. This comes back to the gentleman's point over there. There's massive jobs opportunity here. Secure, high-quality jobs for the next 2 generations in making the transition. Just look at the rubbish housing in Scotland. I quite like it aesthetically, but it is terrible thermodynamically. As my Swedish friends point out, their tents are more efficient than our houses. And so we need to retrofit the existing housing stock that's going to be here in 2050, which is probably most of the houses. 25 million houses in the UK, probably most of those, 17 million or so, will still be here in 2050. We need to make sure all new houses are passive houses and perfectly have use energy as well. So there's a whole lot of work there. We need to eliminate fuel poverty. Every government has tried to do that and fundamentally failed since the Second World War. And so we spend a fortune on health and bills for kids with bronchial problems because they're living in houses that are full of fungus. You know that the landlords are making a fortune. We need to improve our urban air quality. Particularly, of course, it's the poor kids living in the cities that are getting affected by the map routes that we all use as we drive in and out of the cities. So the IPPR does some interesting work in that in London, with the extra cases of congestion charge. Strong indigenous tourist industry. Every pound that flies into the UK, £2.73 flies out from a tourist point of view. Not surprisingly, because it's often a bit warmer somewhere else. Prosperous and healthy future for our own children, and perhaps showing some international leadership. Actually, in this case, I want to say Sweden and also in Scotland. I think you have a sense of being a more progressive place than the UK. I'm not saying it's all going to be easy. I'm not saying that you all agree with that. But I did get, maybe it's been romantic because I've been coming here for so many years, all my life I've been coming here. But it does feel somehow slightly more that it has a social contract. Sweden's got it much more strongly. Scotland still feels like it has something like that. Look at the referendum in Scotland. It may not think it was very good. It was much better than the crap we had about Brexit. That was how not to do a referendum. The Scottish one, regardless of whether it went one way or the other, I thought it was a much richer debate that was had up here. And that was okay. There were lots of problems with it as well. So, are there any deep system changes around the corner? But what I'm suggesting here is system change. I'm trying to say, should we talk about system change? There's no choice. We either change the system rapidly to reduce our emissions, and that's a massive system change, or we don't bother, and then system change hits us called climate change. So one has a slight timeline. So system change is inevitable. It's a natural outcome of our failure debate. When I went to Bonn last year to the COP, I was really depressed when I came back. It was the worst. I don't know many of them anyway, so I don't fly, so it's quite hard to get to them. I get to Bonn. And it was the worst I've ever been to. And I started to think about it, and I sort of wrote something on the way back. And really what I was thinking about was that whether it's politicians, scientists, academics, businesses, journalists, civil society, we're all going there hand in hand, and we're going there fast. And I think we need to be honest about that. But my question then to myself, I was really depressed. It was a 2-day journey back to Sweden. I was really quite depressed. So I wrote this cathartic piece for myself. Is there any light in there? I try to write it, because often when you write, you start to think differently. And one picture of all go to hell in a handcart. You can put your choice of politicians on. No, Elon Musk. So I wrote something, which was actually just for myself, but actually something called The Conversation, some of you might know, picks up sort of academic blog type pieces that got picked up in there. And it got reduced a bit late, and all my nice flowery words got taken out. So hope from chaos, political upheaval will lead to a new green epoch, which sounds a bit desperate, but actually I think there's something in it, so bear with me for a second. 2008, 10 years ago, I would argue there's been a massive set of huge systemic upheaval since 2008. First, the banking crisis. Go back to 2006 and say, I think the Chancellor's just signed a cheque for £500 billion the next year. And it was no one dreamed that was appropriate at all. Yeah, there's something there, sorry, just the air going in that's like, that's fine. So, quantitative easing. I think the banking crisis was something that no one envisioned occurring, or virtually no one. It was a massive system change. And I'm not saying these are good or bad. I'm not saying any of these things are good or bad. You can make your own judgment on that. And we had quantitative easing, massive quantitative easing. My personal view is we shouldn't have spent it all on the banks. Spend half it on the banks and half it on the civil engineers to do our infrastructure. And social media. Who would have ever thought that social media would take off like it has? And after the last election, it was interesting hearing a number of editors on Radio 4, high-emitting, privileged, middle-class person who lives at Radio 4. And they were talking about how they no longer made the weather on the elections. They said, actually, it's social media. And a lot of people argue that's the same for Trump and Obama, and to some extent, Bernie Sanders. But then Sanders and Corbyn, I think, are really interesting. The idea of the Americans, not that far off. I mean, if Sanders has stood against Trump, there's a reasonable chance, and quite a lot of people have said this, that he could have beat Trump because he's actually anti-establishment, as Trump's just a rich boy. So there would have been an interesting competition between the two. But the idea that Sanders, a man who said he was a socialist, wasn't shot, is quite an achievement in the States. So this is system change. But Corbyn, everyone was against Corbyn. The PLP, his own bloody party, were against Corbyn. The newspapers were against him. The Guardian was against him. The Eye was against him. The BBC was against him. No one liked Corbyn, except for social media. And he did remarkably well. And he has changed the discourse, whether you like Corbyn or not, he's changed a lot of the discourse in the UK as a consequence. So I think these are really consistent changes. Brexit and Trump. Go back 10 years. Who would have thought we'd have survived Brexit and we'd be coming out of the EU? I mean, that wasn't something that people were envisaging other than maybe France was, I don't know. And who would have thought someone like Trump would get in the US? I mean, it's like, not Forrest Gump, that'd be much better. But anyway, we thought it's pretty bad with Bush too. But Trump is a amazing character in some respects. But actually, they raise questions about the importance of the establishment and how come questions have been asked about that establishment. That's what's really important here, regardless of whether you think it's a good or bad thing. The Arab Spring. No one saw the Arab Spring coming. Okay, it turned out to be a utter disaster. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but no one expected the Arab Spring. The plummeting price of renewables that keep coming down at the moment, they're not stabilising at the moment. They seem to keep coming down. And that's causing a lot of problems for investors in energy, because you don't know whether what you invest in today is going to be much cheaper tomorrow. And the massive rise in the concern over fossil fuels, I think, but even the IMF saying that fossil fuels are really problematic. So I think there's a whole suite of these things. And what I'm trying to make a comment here is that in themselves, each of these disruptions, they are massive disruptions. So, when you live in a nice environment like Edinburgh, you're coming out of university, you forget these things happen to us. Even the austerity agenda. I mean, that gentleman was talking about people he's dealing with. They suffered the austerity agenda. Simon and I don't think we stopped the austerity agenda, did we? We had to really cut off where we went for dinner or when we went on holiday. So the austerity agenda was felt by some people and not others. But there were still big disruptions. But they were evolutionary, I would argue, in contemporary society. But broadly aligned, I would suggest that you could see something here that guides more towards a much more revolutionary shift in society. And perhaps even a progressive and epoch-changing confluence of circumstances. It's some waffly language there, but I'm not saying it's going to happen. And I think if you left them just sort of chaotically or randomly, there would just be chaos. It would be a disaster. But if we start to try to align these to make an argument, a progressive narrative, whether you're left or right, a progressive narrative, what a good future looks like. I think we failed completely in Brexit to do that in one way or another. And we didn't provide none of the discussions about a good future. It was all about fear on both sides. So a revolutionary shift. And I would also say that most political and economic pontificators, just by naysayers and established elites, and that includes professors, grey-haired professors, remain incapable of seeing beyond their familiar 20th century horizon. I hear repeatedly people talking about what we can do to solve the energy crisis in the 20th century. I'm not in the 20th century, and nor are they. But quite a few of the ones in my university are still in the 19th century. But the 21st century is already proving how the future is a different country and could yet be shaped by alternative interpretations of prosperity and sustainability and equity. And that comes back to us. You're a massive, powerful force here. You can change the way that people vote, or the way that the MPs and MSPs vote in Scotland by your engagement with them, or by your not engagement with them. Either way, they'll be influenced. So do we have something we can offer this new agenda? I would prefer to think post-growth. I don't want to go on about growth one way or another. I think it's a completely unhelpful term to use. Homogeneous framing of the whole of society in one unit called dollars, pounds, or whams. And be open-minded about technical opportunities and limitations. Far too many of us as engineers are wedded to particular technologies. We need to be much more technology agnostic, but think about the broader sustainability criteria. Consider short-term rationing of energy. That's what the issue is about. We have to ration energy. Because in the short term, you can't make it decarbonised. So ration it. Stand up to the bullying of the status quo, the city that Davos said. The amount of academics I come across, particularly PDRAs, who feel, to some extent, tailed in their freedom to speak by their supervisors. We need to open that agenda up. We do not want to hear too much more from people like me. Do we have the cogency, tenacity, and courage to escape? I was tempted not to use this language because it all sounds a bit too picking on this easy expression neoliberal, but I couldn't really find another way around it. I think it does describe it. The neoliberal consensus that we have, not consensus for most of us, the neoliberal consensus that has driven a lot of the elites in our society post-Second World War, really. I think, do we have the courage to question that? I think we're going to have to if we're going to solve climate change. So to conclude, climate change is system change. And if we want to use the sort of logic of carbon budgets rather than the astrology that informs most of our modern work today, I think it makes fundamental questions of our norms and of our paradigms. We need to transform the energy supply, listening to the Marshall-style transformation of it, moving the resources of society to help do that. We need massive penetration of the most efficient end-use technologies. We need profound shifts in the behaviour and practices of people like me and the high emitters, not just the Al Gores, but plenty of us in that top 10, 20%. We need to reframe success, value, and progress. I mean, you just think about the people who seem to be successful in the news, and everywhere we look, it's all those that have massive carbon footprints, have massive consumption. That's considered success. Living in a small terrace house somewhere is not successful. That's a sign of failure. It's like Maggie Thatcher said years ago, if a man's on the bus, they've obviously failed. You shouldn't go on a bus, they should be in a private car driving around. That is not the way you should look at the world. We need to reframe that issue. And I also think, I did a lot of work in economics years ago on my PhD, I'm an engineer, and I do think our current economic model is simply not fit for purpose. In no other discipline would you use the current marginal economic growth model. It's all about small changes near equilibrium. What we are absolutely certain about, we're talking about system level changes far away from equilibrium. You would never use laminar flow to understand turbulent flow in aerodynamics. You would never use Newtonian mechanics to understand quantum mechanics. So almost every other discipline has different framings at different scales, but not economics. Not the current form of economics. There's plenty of good schools out there, but the current one simply not fit for purpose. Great for telling you about competition between stocks on the high street, but not telling you about whether you should what's the technology in India or something like that. So it can't deal with those. This has to start now, you're completing in about 3 decades. Our choice is between a short-term real politic or a sustainable long-term real climate. So it's between short-term economics or 13.5 billion years of physics. And my money goes in the latter. But we've a long way to go. Do we really care about these people? When we think it's reasonable to have private yachts? Do we really care about our own children? When we think it's reasonable to invest billions into space travel, which I was humorously trying to point out, I'm actually not completely against, because as long as the tickets are one way. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and often their carbon footprints to Pluto. I'm happy to fund their tickets if there's any more money. And do we really care about future generations when we think it's reasonable to put, in my case, 85 kilograms of flesh and 3,000 kilograms of car to drive 10 kilometers to pick up 6 kilograms of groceries? Is that a reasonable thing to do? No. Of course it's not. Do we really care about migrants entering our land in Europe who are coming from Syria, where they did have 12 years of drought that did not cause the climate change issue, did not cause the war in Syria, but certainly exacerbated these things. When we think, this is almost somewhere past in Cheshire, when you go out cycling, there's plenty of bedrooms there, can be versus the places coming from elsewhere in the world. So there are plenty of things that we should be doing. Do we care about other species? We're going to wipe out pretty much all the corals anyway. Pretty much gone on, sadly. When we think it's reasonable to establish a gas network. Now, Sweden's building a new gas terminal in Gothenburg. India is planning a whole suite of new gas pipelines to bring gas across to Europe for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Gas is very high carbon fuel. Do we really care about living in this amazingly beautiful, stunning planet, floating in this inky darkness? We don't know anywhere anything like this nearby that we can get to anyway. When we think it's reasonable to fly to a climate change conference or a holiday in Bali. Ultimately, as Alex Steffen said, winning slowly is basically the same as losing outright. In the face of both triumphant denialism, Trump and his friends, and predatory delay, I would argue pretty much everything in the UK, Scotland, all the progressive countries and the predatory delay one, trying to achieve climate action by doing the same thing, the same old ways, guarantees defeat. It means defeat, it guarantees defeat. Scott's climate bill, there's some suggestions where perhaps you can, I don't have to agree with them, but there's some things we could think about. Pushing our MSPs to reform the bill to make sure it is fit for purpose in the 21st century. So on that note, thank you, Bruce.
I know some of you have got to go home, children, or whatever. I suggest that you don't just stand up, turn around. We'll just have a 3-minute break so you can talk to your neighbours. I'm going to pass around some post-its in the last 15 minutes in a little while, and I'm going to invite you to put one thing that you're going to do after. In the meantime, talk among yourselves. I invite you to think how this is making you feel. You've said some outrageous things, you've some really provocative things, some difficult things, and then we say, yeah, we'll go home. Do we? Can we? I'm going to be, as I say, asking you just to put a very small post-it for those before you leave. And I'm wanting us to have a conversation about what we can do. Caroline has already said there's a political process upstairs or down Holyrood and so on. Is that the only process that we can get involved in? Certainly it's very easy to do and imperative, and I hope we'll follow up after this with a little link, etc., that you can do that. But what else can we do? We personally in our own lives do positively to make that change. So that's my provocation to you, and I'll invite you to show hands so that I can make sure that we catch everybody's views.
I would suggest that we need to do something very big and very radical in a practical sense. And my example would be we should stop by next year building homes with gas central heating. All homes should be electrically heated, and to be really radical, I would give the electricity away. Because as the gentleman said, there's a lot of people in fuel poverty. Some of the worst are in electrically heated houses. Electrically heated houses from my generation have got very bad press. But that would be a huge challenge. It would involve all the people. It would involve a lot of work. And it would put a lot of people in employment and wouldn't be that difficult. When I first looked at the output of Britain's power stations to France, I couldn't understand why France produced twice as much electricity as us. The population's the same. Its industry's been as badly decimated as ours has. So what was different? And then I realised it's because they heat their homes with electricity. And as I was saying to my colleague here, if you look at French films, you'll see they've got electrical radiators, not gas central heat radiators. So they're a huge challenge and something that would get everybody involved.
So I originally came to Scotland to study architecture, and actually you can have passive house standards which hardly need any heating. So there's another point. Any points anybody want to?
Hi, my name's Kate. I just want to go back to what you said. I just want to acknowledge the emotions in the room for a minute, because I think it's really weird talking about this in this space, and I am really angry. Let's go into it. I'm also overwhelmed and terrified and really, really sad. And I think that's really valid. And it's kind of a bit weird to brush over the fact that if anyone was actually listening to what that means, then they probably are as well.
You want us to say anything else? Stuart Knowles, I'm the director of Cycling Scotland. The way to sum up what I was thinking about was Philip Hammond's budget yesterday. I watched that, the 10 o'clock news, and I came here tonight and listened to you, and I found what you were saying completely more interesting than any of the roadshows.
Now, as a bearded white man, I'm reluctant to just pass the microphone around bearded white men. So I'm very keen indeed to see if there's any. Thank you. Others.
I was just thinking, those of us that have the wherewithal to do it should start getting solar panels on our roofs if we don't have it already, and there's our heat exchange systems, so we don't wait for government to do it. We just start doing it on our own. I realise that's out with a lot of people's budgets, but if you have the budget, if you have the money, rather than investing it in something else, invest it in your own home and save carbon dioxide.
My name is Rina, and it's interesting because we're talking about individual responsibility. And when we talk about individual responsibility, we talk about behaviour change. And I find that term very challenging. I actually don't like it. And I don't like it because it has a lot of negative connotations. So it's saying that what we're doing is wrong. And when you start to speak to somebody about the individual responsibility and tell them that you're doing something wrong, you don't start off on a good footing. So I think
what we should be doing is changing the narrative. And we should be talking about something like positive action and taking positive steps forward instead of saying behaviour change. I have a huge issue with that.
I'd like to follow some of those comments up, and including yours, last 2 or 3, and David's mention of a passive house. There are passive buildings in Scotland that hardly need any heating, and yet all around this area, all around Edinburgh, all the Lothians, there are hundreds and thousands perhaps of houses being built with conventional heating, with no thought of fuel saving, with very few, with any sort of solar arrangement whatever. And I can speak from personal experience. I have converted an ancient stone house into a very nearly passive house, even in the Lothians here, and it would work further north. But there is another aspect to this. In doing that sort of thing, it actually improves your quality of life. It's not just an economic matter. One can couple decarbonisation, can't go into that in a long way now, but one can decouple carbonisation. You can, wording's wrong. You can lower your carbon output as well as improving your quality of life. So really we should follow that area.
I'm Dave Morris. I don't work for anybody. I want to ask you about tropical rainforest and make a link to aviation. From the political changes in Brazil this week, we can see the Amazon is under greater threat. And globally, the destruction of tropical rainforests is one of the worst ways of putting carbon into the atmosphere. So I don't see that it should be a great problem to have an international agreement which basically says there should be no further felling of tropical rainforests. Now to fund this, I would suggest we look at air passenger duty. The Scottish government has just got the power to control and levy air passenger duty, but unfortunately at the moment they want to get rid of it altogether. Or what I would suggest is that air passenger duty continues to be levied, and it is an environmental tax. So all the money that is raised from that duty is spent on the programme to protect tropical rainforests, so that everybody who sits down on an aircraft seat leaving Scotland knows that part of the ticket price is going towards tropical rainforest conservation. And of course, if it's a percentage tax, the people who are sitting in business class are going to be paying a large sum of money every time they fly, and that large sum of money will be going into tropical forest conservation.
Hi, I'm Magnus Spears. I'm a master's student of just in chemistry building. One of what I've got to say essentially is that I think the way we view this climate change challenge is wrong. We need to see this as a gauntlet being thrown down in front of us, not so much as this burden, this unnecessary thing which we have, this thing that we shouldn't be done. We shouldn't be done for it, but we have to see it as a challenge, something that we collectively have to fight and do together. And we should be well excited, like putting a man on the moon, doing like it's that level of difficulty we're facing, and that level of change we have to do. And instead of being just sort of morose, depressed about it, we need to sort of properly, almost sort of approach it with excitement at the new stuff that we are going to have to create, the new societies we're going to have to develop, and actually just this new world that we have to form, and be excited for that as well.
Thank you, David. On the feeling side, I must admit, I'm a bit like Kevin. I've seen Kevin speak before and he always inspires me, but I always feel sad, guilty and somewhat ashamed afterwards because it is our fault. Our generation didn't know. I've made a personal commitment to myself and what we're going to do about it, to try and make a change, and I'm going to do everything I can to make a change. People who know me know some of the things I'm doing to do that. Somebody at one of the presentations I was at said, what we need is a blue planet moment for climate change. But I thought about that. It's a brilliant thought because it's had a huge impact on plastic use. So anyway, I've got the title because one of the things that Kevin's slide showed was the difference between coral reefs. So coral reefs at 1.5 degrees, about 60 to 70% of them are destroyed. At 2 degrees, they're all gone. So the title for the programme is Killing Nemo. I just need somebody to make it now. And I mean, I know it's facetious, but really, if we had that kind of a programme, I think it would work.
Wave your hands if you guys' hands. It's a nice way.
Hi, my name is Claire Duncanson.
I should explain. I'll try and take new people first. So if that's all right. So new people who are interested, show your hands.
Okay, so when listening to the Today programme on Radio 4, so also outing myself as one of the privileged elite of an academic here at the University of Edinburgh. When I'm listening to the radio in the morning, I'm constantly struck by the way that items on the environment are separate from items. And lots of people have commented on this, that, how is Phil Hammond able to discuss the budget without being quizzed on its implications for climate? So what I wanted to ask was, is there something we can do around lobbying the BBC and other mainstream media such that they have to stop doing that? They have to stop reporting things separately as environmental soft issues and have to somehow mainstream questions on to everyone when anyone's being interviewed on any topic. Well, what are the implications of this plan of action for the climate?
Just wanted to add something to what was being said earlier about using electricity for heat. And so the vast majority of our electricity comes from natural gas. And in the UK, it's 50% roughly. And if we use that natural gas to directly for heating, then the efficiency is much greater than using electricity. And so I just wanted to kind of say that it's important that the electricity that's being used should be used in things like heat pumps rather than kind of just general resistance heating, basically.
Thank you.
There's huge amounts that everybody can do very easily to change their lives. It's all just about commitment and making choices, and it's trying to inform people about those choices, in my view. It's like, I lived in a passive house, I built one. It's not hard. People say it might be. It's not. It's very comfortable. I chose to do that. I've chosen to change my diet. I've chosen to stop flying. I've chosen to drive an electric car and another one. I'm now thinking about trying to even go a step further, downsizing to an electric bike. You can keep pushing it and you can keep making the right choices. It's trying to inform people that it is about our choices, and trying to inform people so they can make the correct choice in terms of trying to protect the climate.
Couple of thoughts. Going back to that young woman over there, I think, it is, we do need to acknowledge the kind of emotional aspect of this. I've got a 5-year-old child, and it's terrifying to think about what is going to happen if we continue to do nothing. All that being said, what is good is kind of giving a sense of, being with it. I suppose moving away from the helplessness that you can feel. I think another really interesting one, this woman over here met about not liking the word behaviour change. I think that is an interesting point. I had one of the worst rows ever I had with a really good friend shortly after my little boy was born, and I put it down. I was all hormonal and exhausted and everything, but there was the road building project in the town that I grew up in Ireland, and it was going to destroy part of the medieval town. I went on a rant about, why is there such a focus on cars? And she was like, well, we need more roads and we need more parking spaces. And I said, what are you going to say to your children in 2050 when they say, you knew about this and we did nothing? And that was one of the worst things I could have done, because it hugely alienated her and hugely angered her. It was me putting myself above her, like what you say about behaviour change. So I think, how do we have the conversations about changing our lifestyles, framing it in a positive way? I really like what that guy said up there about the challenge, and seeing it as almost like a mountain to climb, but in an exciting way, not in a scary way. The narrative is really important, and here we are in our nice liberal lefty greeny bubble, and we'll go back out into the wider world, and many of us don't interact with the people who drive the Land Rovers and SUVs and that, but we do need to reach out to these people. How do we have the conversation, I suppose, is my question.
Who's up for making that conversation?
Just in response to the chat about flights and stuff, and deforestation, you also have to bear in mind that one of the leading causes of deforestation is the animal agriculture, and then a lot of that meat is then exported to places like the UK. So it's really easy to say these kind of times, but it is also down to us to make individual contributions.
Thank you. My name is Jolie, and I was just wondering whether I should need to say this here, but I'm going to say it. I think there needs to be a radical movement, because there's so much supply, there's so much that encourages people to really consume. An example is food. There's so much food brought to the UK, and so much gets wasted. So there's so much electricity, there's so much gas. So anybody can turn on the TV anytime, at any time of the day. So if all that can be limited to a specific time, then people will be forced to use it efficiently. If you know you're going to buy your water in Scotland, you will not waste it. If you know you're going to spend so much money to buy kiwi, as an example, you will not buy it because it is traveling so many miles away. And so much comes here and then we waste it. So I really think before we go to using electricity only, we need to limit how much is there to be used so people can be efficient. They know it is not enough, then they have to use it efficiently. That is what I have to say.
Thank you. Name's Rory O'Riordan. I'm a member of the Scottish Solar Energy Group, SSEG. They have been striving for 30 years to encourage people to put solar panels on the roof to harvest the sunshine and therefore generate electricity. Aside from that, though, my contribution here is that we need to think of the pronoun I, we, they. We had an earlier contribution about a lady complaining about China. They're the baddies. Trump is the baddies. Excuse me, it's a world problem and we need to do something about it. I'm very glad I've sat back with it to hear 2 or 3 people confess to what they've done in their own life. Switching off the light in the toilet is sod all difference. It's pennies. You have to do something really drastic. And I've made a personal commitment not to fly. I love flying, but I will just give you a bit of trouble. The next time you sit in a plane and the pilot's just going to take you off, it's a word bite, 200 and 200. You're sitting there and the plane is doing 0 miles an hour. 200 seconds later, it's doing 200 miles an hour. Now, whatever happened to the CO2 from the aviation fuel? And if you think that's just a takeoff, think what speed do you usually land at?
Stephen Curran from Eco Congregation Scotland. I work with churches and environmental action. So thanks for the quote from the Pope at the start of the presentation. For me, I think that the justice issue is critical, and we need to have conversations that are really about listening to people, particularly those affected by fuel and food poverty, about how this agenda has an impact on them, but how there's a positive impact. that kind of enlightened self-interest we can have as a country, whether it's Scotland, the UK, is really important. And I think we can share those stories with people around practical answers to tackle poverty. And I think it was great that Kim focused on how equity is missing in this story right now.
Hi, my name's Joy Godfrey, and I do some volunteering with the Community Development Trust and some environmental campaigning. I went to boarding school when I was young, and a few years ago I came across a book called Boarding School Syndrome. It talks about that as being sort of trauma, bereavement, imprisonment, exile, massive amounts of loss. And yet a lot of the people who seem to be in leadership positions in our country, in the UK as a whole, have gone through boarding school. And their families are broken up. They can go there when they're 6 years old. So when they might be getting encouragement on brushing their teeth, suddenly you've got to compete. You've got to not show weakness. You've not got to show vulnerability. You might be seen as weak to be compassionate and empathic to other people. And that sort of breeds, it seems to me, being in a rat race. And it doesn't breed the sort of people that I would want to be making policy and legislation, designing technology, and all these things. So these people are very privileged, and they have the opportunity to do that, and they can keep other people out, and that might be just what they've learned. So as much as it's devastating to grow up and to think, what has the older generation left for me? There's still generations which are probably hurting because of what has happened to them when they're young. And if I think about what makes my life full and what I enjoy, there's things like chatting, stories, walks, laughter, board games, art, dancing, fitness, swimming, community cafes, all sorts of things. And I don't need anyone to sell me that. I don't need anyone to invest loads of money. I find it quite offensive to see a picture of Catherine Zeta-Jones in my town as if, like on a bus advert, bus stop advert, suggesting to me that like I might not be beautiful enough, or might need more better makeup, or might need something different. These simple things are fine for me. And if I look at what we could need, what's important, we need permaculture. We need intensive care, really attuned to the learning about the natural environment. And we need care for older people so that they're not sad and lonely and suffering. And I think that if we had investment in some key things like that, rather than always being marketed or entertainment to us as if we have to be consumers, I think that's a much strong thing. I've done some campaigning recently, and within 3 months we started it, and it already got on the SPV and in questions asked in the Scottish Parliament, and I didn't know that that would happen.
Thank you. Just I'm passing these round now. There have been some ideas that things that people are going to do. We can't all speak out. Not everybody's likes speaking out. But I will ask you, would you just write down on one of these pieces of paper, post-its? They're going to go back. Take one and write out, and would you leave it as we go out, and we'll capture some of these ideas that people are going to do.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you very much to that lady in the red shirt for sharing a different vision of the future, because I think that's very valuable. And we're talking here about radical change, and not all, but most of the things that people wanted to make a point on were incremental change. Things like putting solar panels on the roof, changing the tax system. Those things are on how to make the current system less destructive. So not about radical change, but imagining a vision of a future that relies on community, that relies on love, that relies on an interconnection with nature. That's a radical future. And so I wanted to push you as well, Kevin, on the fact that the solutions that you propose are still very industrial. They necessitate a Marshall Plan, for instance, so they necessitate that the West reimagine their whole economy and is it really in line with international equity, and especially in the fact that we live in colonial countries.
I'm being prompted to invite Kevin to share some feelings. But I'm not wanting just to give back to Kevin. I'm wanting us to continue thinking that each of us might have a contribution as well. So, these comments, these suggestions, these heartfelt thoughts, in response to your presentation, Kevin, share, and don't try and answer all of them, but do share some of your own feeling.
Okay, is it working again? Yeah. I think that's what the lady was saying, the lady in red over there. I think that's what's really important. What are the important things to us? What are the things that we value in life? Okay, maybe you had a bad day with your children, perhaps you don't value children, but normally we value our children, our parents, our friends, going out for a beer, in my case, going cycling or rock climbing or, these are the things. Stephen Simon today, I've not seen him in a couple of years, which is a real mistake, because our work is too demanding. Well, that's bloody stupid. Why haven't I been able to see him? That's worth more than all sorts of things that I've done in that time. So the real things we value in the world are the things almost always without price. And I think we have to sort of recognise that and try to structure our societies in terms of saying there, we need narratives. And it's not a narrative, because I always be careful about this, is that we may well all lean, I have no idea where we come from, but let's imagine we all sort of lean slightly left. Then there are also very good people who lean slightly right. My stepfather. We need to find narratives that appeal to him as well. So the narratives always have to fit within a sustainability agenda. However we may couch and phrase that, it should be clear up front what we mean by that. But we need suites of narratives, not just narratives to us. And that's why we like, Naomi Klein's stuff is excellent, but it appeals to people like me. It doesn't appeal to lots of other people I know who need to be brought along. And we haven't found good narratives of engaging with a wider constituency of people who generally find this issue really still very important. But I think putting apart the idea of the citizen and the consumer, and what we have seen over the last 30 or 40 years is we have betrayed ourselves as citizens, and the system has betrayed us as citizens, and we only see ourselves we are only seen within the system as consumers. And I think we need to wrestle back the fact that we are citizens, and often our citizenry concerns are different from our consumer concerns. So we do not vote with our pound, we vote with our behaviours, or with our practices, or our norms. That's when we vote. The discussion on behaviour change is an interesting one we can perhaps get into. There's been a lot of discussion about whether things are behaviour change or system change at a practice level and so forth. But I think I wrote something on a blog on my site a while ago, thinking about this issue, because I often get accused of talking about the individual, but I don't see the individual and the collective as separate, and particularly for those of us who are incredibly fortunate to be in elite positions. And I think what we need to do is drive behaviour change by people like us. I'm not saying it's you, I'm not saying it's anyone here. It's certain people like me and lots of my academic colleagues who still choose to fly. They're not required to fly, the professors, they choose to fly because they get paid for by someone else. That's a behavioural choice they're making. They don't require the kudos that comes with that a PDRA, a postdoc may require. So still lots of us, I think, are making these choices. They are not just elites in our society. We are making choices and we need to be held to account for that. So in that case, it is behaviours, but lots of other times it's practices and norms. So I take your point on that, and that needs to be embedded in the narratives we think about. And someone refers to, I think someone said about personal carbon allowances. I thought I heard someone whisper over here, yeah. And someone said tax up there, and I think there's a carbon tax up there. I think we have to be quite careful about carbon taxes. The carbon taxes tend to be something that elites like me can simply pay. You put the price up on the flight, I'll pay it. Unless it goes very high, which is why I quite like a frequent flyer levy with a geometric increase, but then it's very rapid. But overall, I prefer the idea of something attuned more to a personal carbon allowance, or at least some way of rationing out in a fairer way. And when we have to ration out food, and of course energy is as essential in food in many respects, I accept the fact that we can live in much better houses and we can do that, but nevertheless, in the near term, energy is essential for lots of parts of our lives. And the idea of rationing it on price seems to me to be highly inequitable. We need to be rationing on need and sufficiency, not on price. We never rationed food on price in World War II. Okay, there's a black market to some extent, but by and large, the Duke and the dustman, to borrow the language of the poll tax, got the same allowance. So I think we need to really seriously think about rationing energy. And that's something we need to be trying to address and bring to the fore. I think the debates which we're not prepared to at the moment. But ultimately, this is about, we may disagree a lot what I'm saying, but it is about describing positive narratives. And it should not be a negative view of the world. We need to recognise where we are. We need to take off the rose spectacles and be completely brutal and honest about where we are. And from there, we can be progressive and positive. So my argument, my job, I always think, is to say, this is where we are. Let's strip away all the crap. This is where we are now. And from that position, we can then move forward. The problem is, at the moment, most of the time, our political frameworks, our academic frameworks won't even admit where we are now. So our solutions are never solutions to the problems we face, because we're not prepared to accept the fact we're facing them. So we strip it away, and then we can be positive. We have a progressive narrative about what a good world looks like. And then it won't all look nice for us. My colleagues and friends, when I work in the oil industry, still see the world quite differently to how quite a few of us see it. You know, they do enjoy their speedboats, their large homes. We have to find some way to actually engage them in a debate and say that's not going to be appropriate, at least in the near term, near the medium term, and possibly not ever anyway. So we need to open up that narrative discussion. So I won't say any more on that. I think probably that's enough for me.
Any more points that anybody wants to make? Hold on.
Hello. I think it's worth mentioning the vampire elephant in the room and the stock markets and the offshore spaces where our pensions are invested. Are we personally calling up our pensions managers and going, where's this invested? How's this invested? And will you divest it? I know the University of Edinburgh's been doing something like that. So, yeah, stock markets.
Could you pass behind?
Thank you very much, Kevin and everyone for wonderful discussing. I just wanted to pick up these wartime metaphors that you've been using, which you mentioned that some people don't like. But I think that is how we have to think of this. The war and the aftermath of war are the only times when modern societies have been so centrally directed. And I don't really mean centrally. I mean so directed to particular aims. And you're right that you have to find ways of gathering people in the same shared direction. We have to see this as a project in the same way that victory in a war or economic recovery after a war were seen. And that speaks to some of the other things that other people have talked about seeing this as a challenge, as a gauntlet that's been thrown down. We have to embrace that sense of urgency and immediacy.
Could you pass it to the Czech shirt?
Thanks. So I work for National Bonus Charity, and I think the equality aspect that you've touched on is really, really important. And so a lot of the people that we work with are actually feel poverty, and I think it's I suppose almost a really good opportunity to a certain extent for addressing some of these issues on a wider basis. Obviously, a lot of the people that we work with are not houses at all, but I think it's really important that everyone's voices are included and everyone's engaged with the debate in communities as well. It's not just focused at high images. I think it's really important that politicians hear the voices of people who are in feel poverty or whose children are potentially still going to be affected by these issues.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, just pick up on the point about behaviour change and link it in to my earlier question on evolving the curriculums within our educational institutions. And I guess to put it into context, when we look at entrepreneurial spirits and their ability the ability of entrepreneurs to break new ground and actually challenge the status quo that I think you were emphasising in your talk, how do we actually bring this into education so that people are better able to prototype change and have an awareness of these epistemologies which are about such transcendence? It's actually changing who we actually are and who our communities actually are. And this goes beyond epistemologies of knowledge and of practice. So I guess that's where I was situating that within a discourse of what universities are actually for.
Can I use my privilege and also expand on that a little bit to invite you on your yellow papers or whatever, or think and act, is yes, we can lobby. I'm planning to stop just before, in about 10 minutes time, okay, so everybody knows. And then I'd like some volunteers to help carry these chairs up to the back afterwards, so we can get out by 5 to 9. So in framing this event, I was very keen for us to think about not only the political level, but in our own lives level, in our own organizations where we're working, what are the sort of strategic, structural, systems-changing things that we could or should be asking the boss, asking co-workers, could we do something differently, and so on. So I encourage you to think about some of those things, and maybe we can end on any comments that are on these sort of lines.
Yeah, thanks, David. Chris Cook. I'm a senior research fellow at University College London at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security. 30 years in markets, but better now is what I tell people. I'm fascinated by the discussion, particularly the last few comments, particularly bearing in what I'm working on at the moment. And you see, the Danes have they've actually already gone and done it. 45 years ago, the oil price went from $3, you wouldn't believe it, but $3 to $12 a barrel. 400% increase, very, very rapidly. And the Danes had an oh shit existential moment at that point, because 90% of what they used was from oil. And as a people, they came to a sort of wartime resilience decision. And it wasn't really documented like this, but bipartisan, they said, right, for any given use of energy, we're going to minimise the carbon fuel that we use. That was the organising principle which they took. And I call that least carbon fuel cost, because Kevin mentioned cost and how we value things. What the Danes did was look at energy cost. They didn't look at dollar cost. They didn't look at Danish kroner cost. They looked at energy cost. And everything they did in the last 45 years has been in accordance with that principle. Renewables. What did they do? They bought the cutting-edge wind turbine technology from Havens in Glasgow and turned it into the world's biggest wind turbine manufacturer. They renewable heat all over Denmark. Everything they could do, they did do. And what's the result be? In 45 years, double the GDP, mentioned in Danish kroner. And what else have they done? They've cut carbon fuel use by about 15%. They've done it. And that's how you do it. At $85 a barrel, it's rude not to.
Hi, I'm going to go completely and deliberately against your instruction and go back to the political level, because I think it's actually been shockingly absent through this entire conversation. We've heard already that there's a bill going through Holyrood right now that is going to determine the period of time that we just heard that we have a carbon budget for. The absolute least we can be doing is all lobbying our politicians. I would like to make a provocation that we should be going and occupying the parliament until the bloody bill does what it should do. Sorry, I'm a little bit worked up. That's all.
Anybody else spoken?
On a related topic, a very simple thing we can all do is not vote in climate change deniers from any level of political office. It's an easy thing to say, but it turns out we do actually have at least one representing this area, the councillor, who unsurprisingly is a Conservative. Cameron Rose. So I attempted to correct them. I even invited them here.
So he was here.
So yeah, that's something. Just try not to go me.
Any other points? So I haven't sold enough tickets yet for the Kellner, and I've got a minimum order. So I would take offers of slightly less than 15 pounds if you want. But we will be going and sharing a meal for those of you who want to. And Mike's the person, he'll be at the back. Well, I see there's quite a lot of filled in yellow forms, yellow sheets. I asked them to give to Mary at the back, or one of the friends of the Earth gang at the back as you go out. to pick up the post-its. But get writing if you haven't written something.
Right. I'd just like to pick up on the point that lady just made a minute ago about the political. Tomorrow, my understanding is that a new climate action group is being launched called Extinction Rebellion. And there was an article in The Guardian, I think it was Saturday's edition. There was a letter that was signed by 84 of your colleagues around the country, academics, etc., in support of this new group. And it strikes me that it's time that we do something. Like, we all know all the rationalizations that go on about why we can't do this, why we can't do that. And it's so much bullshit. So to me, I think it is about actually saying no, enough, had enough.
Thanks for letting me speak again. First, I'd like everyone to notice how many elderly people are in Zoom, and I'd like thank you for being here. And I think that's very nice, and I think you'll have in many other countries worldwide. And also, talking about universities and what the third down there was saying about like entrepreneurial education, I think that's completely the wrong way to go. I think like that's a very fancy business school word, and like if we want to change like university curricula, first thing we should be doing is like completely eliminating business school, because they drain out so much funding for PhD and research that doesn't really add any value to the society we should be striving to build. And also from like the political discourse, when there are like huge economic and societal changes, it usually is after dramatic events, after like famines or after droughts or after wars. And I really like the analogy you made with the Marshall Plan, and because that came right after World War II, which completely shifted the economic and political system. So maybe as humans, we are not wired to take action unless something extremely dramatic happens beforehand.
So we're going to wrap up now. And Caroline can, as the co-sponsors, I think obviously we're all hugely indebted to Kevin for coming from Manchester, spending the day in Scotland, thank you. But also I think we're very indebted to those specialists who've bettered their lives to be on the campaign side. So I give Caroline an opportunity to say a few words, and then Kevin can phone up.
Thanks, yeah, I'm really heartened by all of the contributions and all of the thoughts and all of the individual decisions and changes that people are making to try and tackle this and make things better. And I would love to see people occupying places and shouting loudly. And we need to make noise about this, because what we do individually is fantastic and it is part of the solution, but we have to come together. It's absolutely in people power that we will make a difference. And so we can't let this conversation end here. It has to continue. We have to kind of garner this momentum and build people power and forge forward and make change, because whoever it was up here who talked about thinking about the opportunities and the radical changes in a better society is absolutely right. Well, if we put the pressure on and the demand on, we can build a fairer, more equal society. And it's not just in thinking about how we tackle climate change internationally with equity. Think about how we drive the changes in Scotland, a better transport system that works for everyone, that cleans up air pollution, energy efficient houses that tackle fuel poverty. We've got a real chance to build a better future, but it takes absolutely all of us. So I'm going to do an inevitable plug for Friends of the Earth Scotland, because I'm biased and I think that we're doing really good work. So before you leave, I'd really like you to stop by and say hi to Kerrigan, who's at the top. Just add your name to our email list so you hear about things that are coming forward and events where we can get together and mobilise and talk about this stuff. And if you do want to spend your pounds wisely, please join Friends of the Earth, because we don't take money from dirty corporations, and we need your money to keep going and do this good work. So yeah, let's keep going together and build people power and change things together.
I realise I'm sorry, not the self-titled, we don't confuse the invite.
Thanks,
I think we do need the practical things on the ground. And there's a conference that we've called on the 7th of November, and it's in this leaflet. Refer to it, look at it, look on the website, see what it's about. But what we're talking about, that's trade unionists, people on the ground, people in communities, coming together to resist it. I have to tell you, the word class wasn't used today, but it is about class. It's about how power is. You look at Brazil, who voted for that swine? It wasn't the poor, right? What we've got to argue is that society is unfair, and the only way we can change it is those who didn't have to grab what is, that should be their share, and share it in a different way. We can build a new world, but we need to be able to move the corporations, the capitalist class, off the agenda and to create a different kind of world. And therefore, what we're arguing for is that we need to have radical, revolutionary solutions to the problems that we face. There isn't. I'm for lifting up fresh fruit without a bag around it, right? But that ain't going to change the world, right? It might change our world round about us, but it ain't going to change the world. It's still about whose hand is on the knife. Mick McGatty, a miners leader, I'll finish on this, used to say, it's not the slice of the cake, it's whose hand's on the knife. And the poor and the unfortunate and the working class hand has been removed in the last 30 years. Who built the welfare state? How much is our generation proud of the welfare state? I tell you, the young people in this world need to have that same vision. In 30 years, we built a different world 30 years back. We built a fresh... I'll shut up.
Our conference is free. If the opportunity for continuing this networking of people from different sectors is super important. Johanna's going to tell very briefly about one on this Saturday.
I'm not going to tell you about this Saturday. There is something about this Saturday. There's an eco fair down at the Out of the Blue and down Many Street, run by Greenpeace. It's a great fun event with lots and lots of stalls and all kinds of things going on. And we've got a drop-in session about democracy matters, so come and join us. But what I actually wanted to say was some of us old people here remember some of the advantages of being on the war system. Even if it's only by hearsay, I'm not quite so old that I was actually hugely involved in lots of it. But my parents happily said rationing meant everybody was better off. Everybody was healthier. It was good for the whole population. And I think that is an idea that we really should be applying to energy. Equally, I'm awfully glad if somebody said that I'd like to see old people here. I think it's great seeing all these young people here.
Last word for Kevin, and then, as I say, summer tickets from...
Okay. Oh, no one can start all of that. I think the gentleman over there had a really important point. I spent a lot of time, last 2 years in Sweden, and they often say you're keeping the word class. And they wonder what I'm talking about. Because in Sweden, where I live, in the block of flats I live in there, so does the cleaner and the same the caretaker rather in the university building I live in. He lives in the same block of flats that I live in. Never happened in the UK. Never happened. Yeah, the vice chancellors and the professors always live at least 5 or 10 miles away from where the cleaners are. Class is a really pivotal issue here. And I think we have to recognise that our system, particularly in the UK, is dominated by class. And in fact, I would argue that class is more of an issue now than it probably has been for the last 20 or 30 years. Another thing I think is really important, and that's not to say that everything's good about the working class. I mean, I'm saying that we have to recognise that there's a class system there, and it has lots of problems, and it has very disproportionate access to resources and to power. The other thing to remember, I think, is that people in Afghanistan queued up and sometimes were shot to get a vote for democracy. And I think we have collectively here, we have given up on our democracy far too easily. That we need to make sure that we're engaged with it, not just for the voting at the time, but we don't even do that. I mean, how many people turn up to vote in European elections or local elections? They're like no national ones. A lot of us don't engage. It is our democracy. Other people have died to bring us our democracy. People are dying elsewhere in the world to get their democracy. So let's fight for ours. We don't have to agree with everyone voting. That's the benefit of democracy, that we have those engagements and then we have our democratic process. And that goes back to this gentleman here talking about the curriculum. I do think there is something here, whether it's from universities or probably way before that, to start to understand what it is to be in a democratic country. Now, I'm not saying that democracy is the only thing only way forward. I'm not saying that at all. But if in a democratic country, we need to understand the contract that we have as a citizen in a democratic country. It comes with responsibilities as well as, I sound like Tony Blair, that's terrible. So, that's happened. But it sounds like it's responsibilities and rights. Those things are combined together, and we need to start to engage with people, get people to engage in that issue early on. That's what about, culture and philosophy and citizenship. It's much more than that, much more than this sort of framing of society as a consumer. And coming back to the final point, the gentleman was talking about Denmark, and I've engaged quite a lot with the Danes. The Danes have done a lot, but I think also Denmark is a really good example as to where the issue, if you like, the Davos issue is, that Denmark has not reduced its emissions at all from a PLC point of view, no with Denmark, if they take aviation, shipping and imports and exports, because of growth. And however much we may like or dislike the language of growth, if we're not prepared to acknowledge it has real problems in trying to address the challenges that we face, we're not going to address those challenges. Growth is a central issue. But we must not just think it's about growth per se. It can be the distribution of goods within a society, as well as the growth itself. So I think I was tempted to come back on the idea about the Marshall Plan. I was just saying it's the same thing, because I was pointing out my number one issue was about behaviour, profound changes in behaviour and practices by the elites, which is not about material goods. But anyway, so I'll leave it at that. So growth is essential. Class is pivotal in somewhere like the UK, and we must have the courage to recognise that, and it is our democracy that people have died for, so let's please fight hard for it and use it now to push the MSPs to make sure that you have a climate bill that's fit for the 21st century where our children will live. So, thank you.